We are now officially in the finance portion of our agenda, which climate finance has been a huge topic of conversation, of debate, of promises being made this week at COP28. So we'll be digging into these issues, looking at development finance, loss and damage, and how we can make sure leaders are actually good on their promises. I hope you all are subscribed to our Devex Invested newsletter. That is our weekly newsletter where we dig into all things development finance, innovative finance, business meets development, new ways to be able to fund the massive needs that we have on all of the sustainable development goals. But without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Michael Igoe.
Hello, everyone online. I'm Michael Igoe, senior reporter at Devex. Delighted to be back up on the stage for this portion of the day. Particularly excited because I know we have a room full of development finance experts based on the experience I had earlier observing one of our workshops here, where we just had a really vibrant discussion among 3 different groups about how they're working to ensure that climate finance makes its way down to local communities with maximum impact. So I'm hoping that you all will bring that experience to bear for this panel, get some questions ready, and I'm just delighted to be joined by a fantastic group here. Aparna Shrivastava is the Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Kome Ajegbo, down at the end, is the VP of Product Solutions and Sustainability at Africa Finance Corporation. Neha Sharma leads the Evaluation and Learning, the Evaluation and Learning Initiative at the Climate Investment Fund. And Faten Aggad is a member of the African High-Level Panel of Experts on Reforms of the Multilateral System. This is a high-powered group, and I really appreciate you all being here. Development finance institutions are in the spotlight here at COP as key pieces of the puzzle when it comes to getting more money and expertise to climate investments. I'm curious, what does that shift look like in reality from focusing on development to focusing on development plus climate? And Aparna, I wonder if you could start from your experience at the DFC.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think overall, it's really hard to kind of untangle really development and climate. And so I think at DFC, it's been very clear kind of from day one. I and my boss joined as kind of the climate unit within DFC about 2.5 years ago. And one thing that was clear was that climate wasn't kind of an individual vertical. It was something that actually cut across every single sector that we were looking at. And so I think it was actually a pretty natural transition. It wasn't anything along the lines of kind of like taking from another sector by any means. Because I think, let's say maybe 5-7 years ago, when people were thinking about climate finance, especially on the investment side of things, it really was just clean energy and kind of solar and wind, and that is absolutely an important part of the kind of the solution set. But when we joined, I think one of the most critical things that we were thinking about was how do we really broaden that definition to incorporate the wide-ranging impacts of climate across every sector, and by virtue of that, also all of the different kind of opportunities there were for kind of positive impact in terms of financing. And that was, so beyond just clean energy, solar and wind, we're also looking at electric mobility, agriculture, food security, nature-based solutions, health, really kind of every sector of development that DFC was already engaged in.
Wonderful. Neha, how do you think about this challenge of ensuring that development finance and climate action are working in tandem? Aparna talked about there isn't this trade-off. These are in some ways one and the same challenge. But for an institution like CIF that has climate as its core mandate, but yet is operating sort of within the broader landscape of development finance institutions, how does that add up to something that makes sort of coherent sense?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thank you for Aparna for starting us off, because I completely agree with what she was saying about the false dichotomy between climate and development. So I'm coming from the Climate Investment Funds, which is one of the largest multilateral climate funds in the world, with close to $12 billion USD pledged. And we operate through 6 multilateral development banks, and they're development banks. So really, development is at the heart of what they're trying to do through their finance. We were very curious to see in the climate investment funds how our projects had led to development outcomes from climate investments. So last year, we actually ran a mixed methods evaluation across our entire portfolio. And what we found was intuitive, but incredible to have such quantitative and qualitative evidence to back what we thought we already knew. And it proved that false dichotomy, but it also gave us lessons on how to plan better for climate and development together. And the key headline messages coming from that evaluation included, you really need to plan upfront to realize and maximize the development benefits from climate investments. So while we can't take it for granted that just because you have a solar power plant, you're also realizing or maximizing the development impacts. You have to plan for these upfront. So this upfront planning came out as a big headline message. The second headline message I want to emphasize is using a backcasting approach, so identifying in advance what development impacts you want to achieve and then planning for those. And when you plan for those, you need the tracking mechanisms, the data, the analysis, the diagnostic work up front, and then the data collection throughout implementation to be able to then measure the results. The last thing I want to add here is we also found in the evaluation what we started calling internally as super development impacts. And what that meant was there's some development impacts that if realized synergistically, really maximize the benefits. And these include a focus on gender and social inclusion, a focus on capacity development, a focus on skills development. I'll just give one short example. Our investments in Brazil, in the Cerrado biome, we focused on gender and social inclusion, and we found that when we incorporated women in trying to build their capacity on taking up sustainable agricultural practices, where women were involved, in families where women were involved, they were quicker to adopt these new practices than when it was just men. So there's just a lot of synergies, and I completely agree with what Aparna said about the false dichotomy between these two goals.
I love the notion of super development. We might need to make T-shirts after the panel. But I guess both of your comments sort of beg the question for me, if there is no false dichotomy, if there is the opportunity to use climate finance to generate development outcomes, then who cares whether it's climate finance or development finance? Is that more at the institutional donor level so that we can do the accounting to see how much climate finance we've spent? Or does it make a difference to know whether you're working on a climate project with development outcomes or a pure, I don't know if there's such thing as a pure climate project without development outcomes, but why even talk in these terms in the first place? I'll throw that back to either one of you before I move on.
I mean, I think for us, development is in our name. And I think what that means practically is that there has to be a development outcome in every transaction that we do. And so, yeah, I guess for us, there's not really an accounting that kind of looks at projects that aren't developmentally oriented. Yeah.
I would just add that the reverse of what I said is also true. So if you only have pure development programs and projects ignoring climate, you're not automatically going to realize the climate benefits, which is why that upfront diagnostic ex-ante work is so important.
That's why that planning process.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think the intentionality is super important.
Exactly.
Because there's so much more that you can kind of supercharge with it. Because I think when we think about climate transactions, it's about jobs, it's about cleaner air, it's like the development outcomes are very much integrated, but we can very much kind of amplify them if we're intentional.
Kome, let me turn to you. This is a sort of big menu of things that development finance institutions can focus on. It's also a large set of challenges for governments to face, pursuing these development impacts, development outcomes, then also taking into consideration the climate pressures that they're facing and how to add that additional benefit to these projects. How how does that happen in a fiscally constrained environment that so many finance ministers that I'm sure you're talking to on a near daily basis are facing right now?
One has to be creative. You have to think a little bit differently about the type of solutions that you're offering. As an institution where our mandate is to close the infrastructure gap on the continent and to ensure that we do so in a sustainable way, you do have to think about that, right? Sustainability is not just about, from our perspective, is not just about the development and the climate impact. It's also thinking about how do we support these public institutions continue to grow mindful of the climate issues given the debt burdens that they have, right? And I think one of the ways, actually 2 ways we're doing this. One is we launched the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. They are currently fundraising. The target is $750 million. And I think GCF, the Green Climate Fund, has made its single largest investment through this fund with a commitment of $240 million on a first loss basis. So I think that is one innovative financial instrument that will help support what is happening in that space. Specifically with government, some of the work we're doing is looking at blended financing, again, working with institutions like the Green Climate Fund, ensuring that you are taking them away from financing in the markets where you're looking at yields of 12 or 14%, and you're able to help them raise the additional capital they need to focus on critical issues like development and climate with financing facilities of 30, 40 years with margins closer to 2%, right? When you talk about fiscally tight situations, it doesn't get any tighter than this. You have African countries that are coming out of a post-COVID era that have spent more money than they had or should have been spending, but needed to spend. Then you layer on the effect of higher interest rates, and overnight their debt service and debt burden has gone up, right? So you do have to think about how can you continue to support these sovereigns in a way that is constructive and sustainable, but still helping them, focus on the really critical issues that are happening on the continent. It was funny listening to the question about development versus climate. In Africa, we don't have that luxury of saying development versus climate. You have a population that doesn't have access to energy, that doesn't have the infrastructure it needs. You have 50 to 70% of the population that are youth under the age of 20. You need the infrastructure. And then simultaneously, having contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, we are suffering the most. You see what's happening in Kenya and a lot of the East African countries with droughts and the poor outputs in agriculture. So you have to look at it. It's sort of inevitable for us, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And Faten, part of this involves development finance institutions reorganizing or restructuring themselves in order to be able to be responsive to the governments that we're talking about. There's been an enormous amount of focus on MDB reform, the Bridgetown Initiative, the various roadmaps to squeezing more lending capacity out of the big development banks. I wonder if there are pieces of the MDB reform picture or the multilateral reform picture that you think aren't getting the attention that they deserve, but that might bring to bear opportunities to unlock more finance for this dual challenge of development and climate.
Yeah, I think I'll pick up also from the previous point, in that I think there's been so much focus on the reforms of the MDBs as part of the conversation around climate finance, and particularly a focus on the World Bank Group reforms. And even then, without necessarily looking at issues such as increasing the capital of the World Bank, for instance, or how do we increase the capital also of the regional development banks to make sure that they engage and they're able to provide support. So even that piece I feel is incomplete. But even if one looks at financing generally, much of the focus has been on the MDBs. but very little on debt across the board. And so we're looking a bit at debt, but for instance, not enough at how do we deal with private creditors. And in the case of several African countries currently discussing debt relief, be it Zambia, be it Ghana, Kenya to some degree, the issue of debt is so central, and yet even unfortunately now at COP28, where one would have expected it to be central to the discussion on finance, has been largely absent. And so to me, it's really that debt conversation, both vis-a-vis international financial institutions, but also with respect to private creditors. The second point that I wanted to raise is that if we look at the multilateral system more generally, I think there's a discussion also to be had on the role of the trade architecture in potentially freeing up additional resources. There was a desire, let's see now how far it could be taken within the scope, particularly within the discussion on the global stocktake, where there have been attempts to at least open up the conversation around trade. But if I take the case of Africa, for example, where some of our partners, I take the case of the European Union particularly, because that's the concrete case, that is erecting carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And if one takes the carbon border adjustment mechanism particularly, and once it starts being fully implemented at the end of 2026, will lead to a loss that our modeling estimates a loss of 25 billion per annum of revenue, and that's based on the 2021 GDP levels. And so, you know, when the fiscal space is restricted, when revenue was restricted, where international financial institutions are slow to reform, I think we need to look at all options that are before us and not just one component. I mean, obviously the MDB reforms is very critical, but that's just one aspect, one piece of the puzzle. And so we need to leverage the different areas for maximum gain.
Great. Anyone want to jump in there? If not, I'll go to another question.
I mean, I would even take that one step further. I mean, I support everything you said. I would say instead of necessarily creating new institutions to channel these funds through, why not work with established existing institutions that are showing that they have a clear track record and capacity to implement these solutions, right? Instead of creating yet another entity for Africa, again, that is the context of the AFC, give us the money to do the work, or come co-finance with us, right? Or any of the other African institutions that are closer to these issues and have a better understanding of the risk, right? That would be my suggestion.
Yeah, and I think you rightly sort of question the dichotomy between climate and development, but maybe more to the point is this fragmented landscape of climate finance institutions, development finance institutions, you know, different funds. How can we get to a point where there's a sort of comprehensible system for, you know, finance ministers to be able to understand who's providing what type of finance for what, you know, type of need, and to know where to go, you know, to access that? What's the sort of, how can we sort of shift things towards something that's a little bit easier to navigate?
Yeah. One thing that one approach that we use from the climate investment fund side is what we call the programmatic approach. And the intention of the programmatic approach is to make large-scale investments by bringing together quite diverse stakeholders together upfront in the beginning. And the intention of working through the multilateral development banks is to not work through just one MDB at a point, because we know that they can have some siloed approaches, but to bring MDBs together upfront in a country-led process and through multi-stakeholder consultations. So that programmatic approach that can really get to identifying the structural or foundational systems level needs of a country. So it's not just project by project in a fragmented way, but a comprehensive set of projects that are really getting to the underlying systemic injustices or structural changes that are needed to move the system in an incremental and transformational way. And our intention of the programmatic approach is to achieve that by bringing all these stakeholders together around an investment plan, which is the beginning of any type of investment that we do from the climate investment funds. So that's one approach.
Great. Yeah, great. I'd love to see if there's a question from the audience. I'm going to ask one more, but if you want to be thinking of them now, please do so. But Aparna, I was struck by your point earlier that climate finance used to be renewable finance, mitigation finance. Now it pretty closely resembles development finance, and we're talking about health, we're talking about gender equity, and all sorts of things that development professionals have long been focused on. At the same time, it doesn't seem to me that the climate finance has necessarily followed into those domains. I mean, we've heard a lot this week about how adaptation is still severely underfunded. So I guess I just wonder, is there a mismatch between sort of supply and demand here?
Great question. I mean, I think if you look at any of the estimates around the financing needed for mitigation, needed for adaptation, we are woefully under-resourced at the moment. But I'd say that, I think there's quite a bit of, I guess we have to think about it kind of taking a step back. When kind of from the USG perspective, the US government perspective, on the adaptation and resilience side of things, while an institution like DFC might not have as much happening in terms of adaptation deployment, there is a lot more maybe coming from USAID or MCC, and I think that really is kind of a result of the financing tools that we have at our disposal. DFC only has kind of debt, equity, technical assistance, et cetera, to provide, whereas USAID can come in with grants. But I'd say from that perspective, we also recognize that there is a lot more that needs to come from the private sector, specifically on adaptation. I think CPI's report just in the last few weeks had reported that we are at an all-time high. We're at the highest levels. I think we're at $68 billion in terms of adaptation and resilience financing, but 98% of that is coming from public sources. And so we do need to kind of drill down on that. And I think for DFC, the way that we're thinking about kind of the adaptation finance side of the things using our tools is a few different things. So one is we've been involved in a few different debt for nature swap transactions, so specifically the Belize Blue Bond transaction in Galapagos as well. That has enabled the unlocking of significant amounts of capital. And then the other kind of mechanism that we're looking at is funds and financial intermediaries that can really kind of provide the smaller ticket capital that SMEs, for example, that are looking at adaptation solutions might need, just given that our ticket sizes can't get that low. But in terms of the sectors, ag, food security, water, built environment, health, those are all areas that we are looking at investments to really kind of help scale the adaptation finance from our balance sheet as well.
I'd welcome anyone else to jump in on that set of issues, but let me just see if we do have any questions from the audience before we... Yes, there's one in the back. Darshan. I think we have a microphone floating around. We did. Oh, sorry. I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Nana Yirinchi Oforiota. I'm from the Development Bank of Ghana with the Climate Finance team. And I just had, I don't know, I wanted to know why don't we take a page out of the history books where we look at the US stepping in World War II for Europe and developing the Marshall Plan to really structure the EU to create essentially what they are today. I fear that we may be tap dancing around the conversation a bit in terms of the funds are raised, but there's a problem of it being channeled into the right places. You hear of $100 billion being raised, but what, 2 billion is available? Or the exact specifics, I don't know, but there's this, it doesn't get to where it's meant to get to. So why don't we structure the AU or really do a full capacity building for like a year or two so that we can identify where the funds go, or we can, really structure it so that the development that we seek can be obtained. I just kind of wanted to get your mind on that.
Right.
I mean, I have some views on this. We could spend another hour or two discussing why that will not happen.
Please, at the cocktail reception here.
But I think, that your observation and comment linked to the prior discussion we were just having, I think is absolutely critical, where you asked, are the demands and the sources of the financing just not aligned? And they're not aligned. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about that, right? You have an abundance of climate finance that is not going where the availers of the funds want it to go. And that is the fundamental issue, right? If we, again, look at Africa, which is my area of expertise and focus, you have climate finance funds that everybody wants to put in renewables. That is not the only way, or really, if I'm being honest, the pathway for Africa. When you are looking at a continent that doesn't even have baseload power, how do you talk about transition? What are we transitioning from, right? You don't transition to only renewables if you don't have baseload power. I would love everyone here to take a moment, think about you sitting in your home, looking out the window, watching a beautiful sunset, and then all of a sudden your power goes out because you're working only on renewable source. And you're going to spend the night in your home without any air conditioning or without any cooling because you're working just on a renewable source. It doesn't make sense. Even if you want to look at battery storage, nobody's talking about financing mining. How do you develop a battery without cobalt, without copper, and these critical minerals that have to be mined? And when they are mined, how are they being developed? They're being put on ships that are going around the world. If you look at the contribution of shipping today, it is the third largest emitter. So we are really not getting to the heart of the matter, if we want to be honest. And this is why the climate finance funds are not really going where they should go. AFC has put out a couple of white papers on this issue. I'll quickly wrap up. The first we put out ahead of COP27, saying we have a pragmatic approach to net zero. We need to localize, we need to rebuild, and we need to finnovate, right? We need to do things at the source. We need to think about our infrastructure to the point we've been talking about. We have to develop thinking about climate to ensure that our infrastructure is resilient. And we also need to come up with innovative financial instruments, which we are doing. Just a few days ago, we also launched at COP another white paper on carbon, when we're thinking about innovative instruments and ways to channel funds. The carbon markets are not fair. Why is it that on the continent, folks are selling carbon for $5, $10, and then you have detailed case studies about what is happening in the Amazon, where they are selling carbon for $50, $100, and higher dollars, right? So we also need to think about what is the real end goal here. But like I said, this is the conversation we can have for many, many hours.
Well, we will have you all back to have that conversation again. I've got scary red numbers blinking at me right now. But I hope you all will have a chance to connect with our panelists. In the meantime, please give them a big round of applause.